Hello everyone, we're here to talk about A Rude Life, which is my new memoir, and here to do it with me is my old pal Sachin Pabreja. Sachin is not a TV professional, as you may have guessed, so we're going to treat this just as a chat. We're just going to talk like two old friends, which is what we are, and then afterwards feel free to ask us whatever questions you like. All yours, Sachin.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you for sparing time, and thank you to all the viewers of American Express. A Rude Life
Yeah,
is currently #1 sellers.
correct.
Congratulations on that, sir.
Thank you, but I'm just lucky.
So my first question is, because many people of my friends, family, because I bought on 23rd of June, first copy was
All right.
delivered to me, where the first question was, so why rude?
Why rude? I actually didn't think of the title. I keep having to explain this to people because by some accident my food column was called Rude Food, and people asked me for many years, why is it called Rude Food? And the answer was, there's no real logic. It was partly because it's an irreverent column, but mostly because we couldn't think of any other name. So when it came for the Penguin Department of Marketing to look at this book, they said, why can't we call it A Rude Life? And I was not that keen on it because I knew you'd ask me these questions, but they said it'll sell, and it has sold, so I can't argue with it.
And so what inspired you to write this book?
Oh, nothing creative or dramatic, just this damn lockdown. Remember the first lockdown, which was really drastic. You didn't even have much Zoom in those days. You were restricted to home. Shops were not open. I just sat at home frustrated, and you couldn't even write because you couldn't get out and meet people. There was nothing to write about. So out of, I think, just a pure sense of self-indulgence and wanting to keep myself occupied, I said I'll write about a subject that doesn't need research, i.e. my own life. And then when you do an autobiography, you have to work on the assumption that everyone's really interested in your life. Now, if you're a journalist, if you say Shah Rukh Khan, that's fine. But if you're like a journalist, nobody really cares, right? So what you have to write about, or at least what I thought I had to write about, was not so much what had happened to me as the people I had met, the things I had seen, mainly because I've been around so long, I've been in a position where I've seen lots and lots of what's happened in India. So I sat down and I wrote it not as an autobiography. There's not that much about me in the book, but as a memoir.
So we are reading your articles for many years.
Okay.
I've seen you on the television.
Yes.
So who is the most toughest person to interview?
Oh, I don't know. There's two kinds of tough. There's the kind of person like, say, an Amitabh Bachchan, who doesn't answer very many questions, who doesn't like answering them, who doesn't like giving of himself. And many people who've interviewed me for this book, say Barkha has interviewed me, and she said the most difficult interview she'd ever done was Amitabh Bachchan. But if you know how to get around those people, and I know with Amitabh how to do it, I've always had good interviews with him. My problem is not the reticent people, because your skill as an interviewer is to bring them out. My problem is the bullshitters, the talkers. There are all these guys who give the same interview to everyone, and it's very difficult to get past the bullshit and find the truth. So which one of them has been the most difficult? I can't tell you. Most politicians is the honest answer.
I was also reading, sir, there was an Imperial Hotel mentioned when you went with Mr. Vajpayee at Japan.
In Tokyo, yes?
Yeah, so that was quite interesting, sir. Would you
Thank
like
you.
to share something about that?
What bit about the Imperial? What bit did you find interesting?
You talked about their food.
Yeah, I found Japanese food very interesting. What I did in Japan, because what I started doing with everybody is when you travel with the Prime Minister, you go on the Prime Minister's plane, you come back on the Prime Minister's plane. Usually your schedule is dictated by the Prime Minister's schedule, so you don't really have much time. You go to the media hotel, you go and cover things, you come back. So what I started doing was, after the official part of the Prime Minister's trip was over and everybody headed back to Delhi, I would stay on. I'd stay on for 3 days or 4 days at my own expense, and I would go around and try and understand things. And I went to Japan for the first time with Mr. Vajpayee, and all of them went back, and I stayed on in Japan, and I tried the food, I tried to understand Japan, and I've been back twice since then. But the basis of my understanding of Japan was that trip.
Great, sir. And so, what surprised you the most while you were gathering information and writing? Because most of the stuff you have seen it yourself when the book was written. But what inspired you the most?
Oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know if there are that many surprising things. I think there's two ways to look at it. One is to say that if you're a journalist, you've seen lots and lots of people and been to lots of places, you're quite jaded and nothing is very surprising. There's a voice in my heart that tells me you can't do that. You must say that everything is surprising. You must be surprised by everyone, by all the things you see, all the people you meet. And I've been traveling, just even within India. I went to Goa, for instance, this summer, and I've been to Goa more times than I probably had hot dinners. But I went to Goa in the monsoons, I sat on the beach, I looked at the birds, and that was inspiring, that was surprising. So I think the message of this book is to find pleasure in little things, to understand the little joys of life, not to care that much about the big picture, because you have no control over the big picture. The small picture is yours.
So, what subjects which you mentioned your parents think of the book?
I don't know. I mean, it's been surprising that many people, everyone who's actually interviewed me for this book, and I've done a lot of them, everyone has asked about my parents. For those of you who haven't read the book, and I hope you will soon, it begins with my childhood and the circumstances in which I was born. My parents had a very romantic, I suppose, love story in that my father was very lower middle class. My mother was super rich in Ahmedabad. My father was a communist. My mother's father, hated the idea of this communist poor boy coming near his daughter. But my mother persisted and wanted the relationship to happen. And she was well educated. That sent her off in the 1940s to America. She'd been to Michigan University, to Purdue University. So she got a job in Bombay and she made quite a lot of money in that job, which is not difficult. She was living in a flat her father had bought her, so she had no expenses. But she saved all that money, and one fine day in 1951, my parents eloped. My father went on ahead to Paris, which he was covering some UN conference allegedly, and my mother took a ship and went off to Paris, met him, and they had this incredibly romantic wedding. My mother, having got there, told my father, who was a communist and didn't believe in all this stuff, that she wanted a Hindu wedding. Now, it's hard enough to organize Hindu weddings in foreign countries, unless you're a rich Marwadi family, of course. But for my parents to organize a Hindu wedding in 1951 in Paris was almost impossible. Fortunately, there was this Indian delegation to the UN. So my father went to P.N. Huxer, who was then the head of the delegation, and said, "What can we do?" And he said, "No, we'll find a way." So Appapant, who was a foreign service officer, was a Pandit, did the ceremonies, did all the religious part of it. Huxer organized the reception. And so in December 1951, miles away from India, with her parents seething with anger, my mother married my father, doing peras in the middle of Paris.
Fantastic. So there are a lot of politicians, a lot of actors, a lot of celebrity, a lot of people, even chefs mentioned in that. So this book is great if you want to go across, like it's a multi-starrer book written very passionately. So something about Mr. Thackeray,
Bal Thackeray. Oh,
yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've been criticized for that. I knew I would be criticized for that because in the eyes of many people who are liberal or whatever, and I think I would consider myself to be a fairly liberal person, Thackeray is a hate figure. They say he divided Mumbai, or Bombay as it then was. He spread hatred. He promoted violence. Now, I have no problem with any of that. I don't think I agreed with his politics. But at a personal level, he was actually a very nice fellow. It's very hard to explain this to people, but the world is not divided into black and white. It's not that every politician you don't agree with is a horrible man and every politician you agree with is a wonderful person. I know many politicians whose politics I agreed with who were really dreadful people. Now, in the case of Thackeray, I liked him because I got to know him in 78. I was 22 at the time. He was already Bal Thackeray. He was this big deal. But he treated me with the utmost respect. He treated me like he would treat a senior editor. He paid attention to my questions. He invited me home for dinner. If I went to my car after dinner, he would walk me there. I mean, who does that? Which politician does that now? I was this 22-year-old kid. He would, as he closed the door, he would shout, Jai Maharashtra, and I found this very irritating. So I would shout, Jai Gujarat. And he took no offense. He would laugh, and because he knew I was a Gujarati. And we did this compromise in which we would say Jai Mumbai, because Mumbai is the same word in both Gujarati and Marathi. And he had that willingness to accept criticism of what he was saying. I got to know him quite well because I went often to his home, and he didn't actually have any politics that I agreed with. But it was hard not to be swayed by his charm, or the fact that at a human level, we went out to a restaurant once for dinner. He was fun to be with.
You have met Mr. Modi when he was
Yes.
Chief Minister. And
Before he was Chief Minister, when he was just BJP General Secretary.
fantastic. Just tell something about her.
Well, I have to say in all honesty that I have not met Mr. Modi since he has become Prime Minister, and I believe I am not alone in this because only a handful of journalists have been allowed to meet him. But Narendra Modi, I knew before he went off to Gujarat when he was the General Secretary of the BJP, was a gregarious person, an open person. He was going to take jokes. I met him quite often at Arun Jaitley's house where he would come and have dinner. And I think once he worked out that I was also Gujarati, there was a certain kinship. We would laugh, we would chat. I used to do a show then called Question of Answers, which was like a panel discussion for Star, shot in Noida. I invited him on that, I think at least once. He came over, he came to the studio. There's a clip floating around somewhere on YouTube. He joked with Jairam Ramesh, asked him to come and join the BJP. He was a very, very different person from the Mr. Modi we see now, who is a sort of Olympian figure, head and shoulders above everyone, who everybody bows before. He was a regular, normal guy.
Right. So, how would you rate freedom of media in older days and at the present days?
I think freedom of the press has always been guaranteed to anyone who happens to own one. Now, one of the things that we've seen is that because of the multiplicity of social media, the fact that I can be doing this interview with you and we're not on any television channel, it's possible now for people to get through to people using the internet, using new media. And so therefore there's such a multimedia world in terms of television, in terms of blogs, in terms of digital television, that freedom of the press now is much more difficult to control. If you have just a handful of newspapers, you can control them. But when anybody can go out and tweet, anybody can go out and do a blog or a video blog, it becomes much more difficult to control. So in that sense, technology has been an advance for freedom of the press. In terms of what we call MSM, mainstream media, I don't think there's any doubt that mainstream media is now much more frightened of this government than it was of previous governments, and therefore there is a tendency to do as much sycophancy as you can of the government for fear that something terrible will happen if you don't.
Two famous men.
Yeah.
Rajiv Gandhi and Sanjay Gandhi.
Okay.
So tell us, because
I never met Sanjay Gandhi, so I can only tell you what I have read and what I have seen. When the emergency was declared, many people who were liberals were against the idea of an emergency because it meant getting rid of civil liberties, censoring the press, locking up the opposition. And yet, and we try and magic this away now, I suspect that most of the Indian middle class supported the emergency. They liked the idea of a family planning program. They liked the idea that trains ran on time, that trade unions were controlled. And the economy also was in better shape because until the emergency was declared, we'd had very rampant inflation. There was very strict monetary policy which brought inflation under control. It would have happened even if there was no emergency, but people tended to think that the two were linked. All of this worked, I think, till the beginning of 1976. So emergency is June 75. In 76, the mood began to change because people had been told that Mrs. Gandhi was doing this to save India from the nefarious designs of the opposition. And yet, suddenly in 1976, she began promoting her son. Now, she had two sons. There was Rajiv Gandhi, about whom very little was known except that he was a pilot with Indian Airlines. And there was Sanjay Gandhi, about whom even less was known, except they were vaguely aware that he tried to build a small car which hadn't worked, that he was essentially a motor mechanic, that he'd been sent abroad to study and had failed at that. And he hung around with very disreputable characters. And then, much to our horror, Sanjay Gandhi was launched as this great new youth leader. He became, in no time at all, the most powerful man in India, just as his mother was the most powerful woman in India. Ministers would fall at his feet. He would sack ministers. He would order places demolished, like say Turkman Gate. He was really a dictator in many ways. And yet Mrs. Gandhi seemed blind to any of Sanjay's faults. There was a suggestion, and I think more than a suggestion, that not only was Sanjay number two, he was also the heir apparent. And when Mrs. Gandhi won the election again in 79-80, and when the Congress came back to power, there was no doubt that Sanjay called the shots. And I think we forget how important that was. It showed us the venality of Mrs. Gandhi, that whatever noble purpose the emergency may have once had, there was no noble purpose to promoting a sort of motor mechanic. And secondly, it also, in a sense, made dynasty legitimate. And you'd had political families before, but rarely had you had top leaders in their lifetimes promoting their sons or daughters so blatantly. For instance, much is made of Mrs. Gandhi being Jawaharlal Nehru's daughter, but he didn't make her prime minister. She became prime minister 2-3 years after he died because of a demand from within the Congress. But here was Mrs. Gandhi turning her back on what her father had said and pushing for dynasty. And when Sanjay died, she pushed the other son forward, Rajiv. That is what made dynasty legitimate in this country. That's why every political party now is a family-run business, with the exceptions of the CPM and the BJP. And even the BJP, there are more family businesses than there should be. So I think when Sanjay died, it was a huge tragedy for his family, but I think India was saved. As for Rajiv Gandhi, he was odd person in the sense that he hated politics. His wife hated politics even more than he did. He tried his hardest to stay out. And yet after Sanjay died, when Mrs. Gandhi went into this big depression, and she kept saying to him, you have to stop flying, you'll also die in a plane crash, he stopped flying. Then she said, now you have to join politics, you have to help me. And he was very reluctant to do it. And remember that when Rajiv joined politics, there was no suggestion that Indira Gandhi was going to die. They thought that she'd last for another 20 years or so. So he joined politics to help his mother. And then, of course, after Operation Blue Star, it became clear what was going to happen, at least to Mrs. Gandhi, because Rajiv's wife Sonia told me that Mrs. Gandhi called the family and gave very detailed instructions of what was to happen, how things were to be disposed of in the event she was assassinated. And sure enough, she was assassinated on October 31st, 1984. And the Congress then pushed Rajiv forward as candidate. And P.C. Alexander, who was Mrs. Gandhi's secretary, has written a book about this, and he's told me this in an interview. He was at Ames where Mrs. Gandhi's body was lying. She just died, so it wasn't really in state, but her body was still there. And he opened the door to a room thinking it was empty, and there he saw Rajiv and Sonia having this fight, in the sense that Sonia was certainly hysterical and was shouting at him, was saying, no, 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 you can't do this, you can't agree. And Rajiv was trying to calm her down and saying, no, I have to do this, I don't have a choice. And I asked Sonia later that Alexander says that when Rajiv was going to become prime minister, you fought him and you stopped it. She said, yes, I fought him. And I said to him, I said, they've just killed Mummy, which is what she called Indira Gandhi. They will kill you too if you join politics. And Rajiv said to her, you know, they will kill me anyway, which sadly is what happened.
Thank you. Quite emotional, and thank you very much, sir, for your time.
No.
And if you have not got your copy, it is available next doors. Just go there or buy it on Amazon. Thank you. Welcome back. So now open for questions and answers, like people can ask, and we have already got some questions. So Mr. Sanghvi, first question is from Ms. Divya Jain.
Okay.
As a journalist, columnist, and author, what is your advice to those of who would aspire to write but are not really from the lineup, so to say?
Okay, yeah, all right. First of all, thank you all for watching. Welcome to this part of the program. I have to tell you that Sachin and I shot the conversation briefly a few days ago, and then I went off to Lucknow, and I've just got off an aeroplane, so if I seem slightly rumpled, please understand and forgive me. Okay, in answer to Divya's question, I think regardless of whether you're writing professionally or you're writing for love, there are two kinds of writing. There's the kind of writing you do which is fictional, which is about characters, where the writing is part of it, but part of it is creating the world your characters inhabit. I can't do that. I'm a man with a very limited imagination. And then there's the non-fiction writing, the kind of stuff that I do. And my advice to everybody, whether they're professional journalists, amateurs, or even kids doing an essay at school, is that how you write doesn't matter. People often say use big words, put in quotations, try and sound impressive. Don't do any of that. Write very, very simply. The purpose of writing is not to show off, it's to communicate. So the most important thing is not the quality of your language. The most important thing is how you organize your thoughts. If your thoughts are well ordered, if one thing flows from the other, if it's well organized, then whatever you write will be readable and people will like it. So don't put big words, don't use big phrases, just do simple stuff like think it out before and put it down on paper. Okay, what's next?
Next is by Mr. Chaudhary. He is asking, he has heard a lot about Morarji Desai.
Okay.
He would like you to share Morarji Desai's legacy and contribution to Indian politics.
When I find it, I will let you know. No, honestly, I don't think there is any legacy. I think Morarji Desai represented a certain kind of politician, a politician who claimed to be a Gandhian, was in favor of prohibition, who bragged that he had not had sex with his wife after he was 40, I think. And he made those kind of great claims and did a lot of virtue signaling to indicate he was better than other people. I actually find that that is a perversion of Gandhiji's legacy. Gandhiji's life was not about abstinence alone. Gandhiji's life was about much more. But unfortunately, after his death, many politicians took those aspects of his personality and turned them into personal fetishes. And I think in the process, destroyed Gandhiji's legacy. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Yadav asked, a lot of people have read your book.
I hope so.
And are loving it. He's also read the reviews, and the critic is very intriguing. What's your thought on that?
On what the critics say? Honestly, I don't necessarily pay that much attention to reviews. I do read them, and I've reviewed books myself, so I know how these things are done. I've done long review essays. So the thing to remember about a review is that every critic's opinion is just as valid as yours. That often there are things you will do wrong when writing your book, which you won't realize it. Your friends won't tell you. Critics, whose job it is to be critical, will tell you what's wrong with the book. So you must read it, you must try and absorb what they're saying, and then move on, not take it to heart, not mind. All criticism ultimately helps.
Another question is, sir, we also discussed last time. Can you please share your views on the change in era in journalism in 80s compared to today?
Oh, very, very different. I think in the 1980s, the most significant factor in the role of the media was that there were newspapers, same newspapers as today, Times of India, Indian Express, Hindustan Times, Hindu. But none of those papers was very good. Most of them were not good at all. What you had then was a magazine boom. Your magazines like India Today, later Sunday, Business India, Stardust, coming along and changing the rules of journalism. These were the places that had all the talent. These were people who were young on the whole, were not spoiled by the preconceptions of Indian journalism, who wrote well, who asked questions that normal journalists were not asking, who in fact created the Indian journalism we know today. The other changes start happening around the 90s when newspapers realize that they're in trouble, and newspapers start hiring people mostly from the magazine world. If you look at all the great newspaper editors of the last 10 or 15 years, 20 years, all of them really had some magazine experience or the other. Newspapers took what magazines were doing, tried to implement them in their work, and ultimately I think we got to a situation where we are today, where magazines are dying and the newspapers are in trouble. Enough of them are still flourishing. So that's one important difference. The other difference, of course, is we had no television in those days. It was all print. Television has changed the rules of the game. Television means people often react instantly to things. The third change, which is self-evident, I suppose, is digital, which makes things even more instantaneous than television, which has changed things even more. So three things, and a fourth, which we don't often realize is important, but is important, is that in the 1980s, we didn't have really a consumer market of consequence in India. You could only buy an ambassador or a Premier Padmini. You couldn't go out and buy products. Once the consumer economy took off, following the 1991 reforms, there was a lot more money in the media because there were advertisers. So that changed the nature of the media. In the 1980s, our salaries were low. We lived quite simply. Now we do a little better.
Great. We have another question from Mr. Yadav. As a journalist...
Same Mr. Yadav?
Yeah, Mr. Yadav.
Okay, all right.
As a journalist, the best part of your career incorporated writing and reporting on subjects and situations.
Yeah.
How does it feel now that you have written a memoir about yourself and your experience in life?
Yeah, I actually thought I've always enjoyed writing more than I enjoy anything else. I've been on television, I've edited magazines, I've edited newspapers, I've run websites, and all of that is fun. I'm not knocking it in any way. But if you ask me what I am, I think at core I'm a writer. I like writing. It's something I enjoy. It's something that gives me satisfaction, because I think I am by nature a solitary person. I am a loner, and writing is ultimately a solitary activity. You can go out, you can do research or whatever, but ultimately it's you sitting down and writing the article. Making a television show is not a solitary activity. Like now you can't see this, but there's a whole television crew, there are cameramen, there are soundmen. It's a group activity. Producing a newspaper is a group activity. So I enjoy solitary activities. And I wrote this book during the pandemic because I was stuck at home, and I found it very therapeutic. I enjoyed the writing.
Mr. Bilwal is saying he's appreciating the show. He's saying great show. Just one question: is there anything common between Indian recipes and Indian politics? Current scenario.
Khichdi. There's a lot of khichdi in both. Masala, mirchi. That's common between recipes and politics. And I'm trying to think what else there is. Basically, those things. If you look at, say, Western food is, say, a steak or a roast chicken with potatoes. It's quite boring. Indian food is not boring. There's spices, there's masala, there's excitement. You don't eat just one thing. You eat 4 or 5 different things at the same time. So Indian food is a little bit then like Indian politics, not boring, but full of masala. Okay, we're ready for the next one, if you find one.
Yes, sir. Sakshi is asking, can you please let us know whose interview you have enjoyed the most?
Hi, Sakshi. I'm trying to think which one that is. I don't know. I mean, my problem is that I always think the best interview I've done is the one I did most recently. But there are many interviews I've enjoyed. Most recently, the interview I probably enjoyed the most was the Dalai Lama. We went to Dharamsala to do it. And he's a remarkable man. I can sit and listen to him for hours. You can ask him questions about anything, politics, spirituality, sex even. And he will discuss it openly, without any reservations, with compassion, with love. And when you interview him, it's sometimes difficult to be bad to him because, you know, he is the Dalai Lama and you can sense his essential goodness. But at the end of the day, we're journalists, we have to ask tough questions. So I did that. But I always regard meeting the Dalai Lama as very special.
Great. Mr. Vats is asking, can you please enlighten us Mr. Atal Bihari Vajpayee's charisma over Mr. Narendra Modi?
Oh, very, very different people. I think Mr. Narendra Modi is a lot like Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi was a solitary leader. She was out there. Everybody around her seemed like pygmies. There was nobody of her stature. I think Mr. Modi is like that. No matter how distinguished his ministers or people around him are, they don't quite match up to his stature. Mr. Vajpayee, on the other hand, was a consensus man. Mr. Vajpayee and Mr. Advani were friends, and Mr. Vajpayee was certainly the superior leader of the two, which is why he became Prime Minister. But there wasn't that much of a gap between them. It could easily have gone the other way. Mr. Vajpayee, when he made a decision, tried his hardest to do it by consensus, tried to get everybody to go along. Mr. Modi, like Indira Gandhi, believes that he knows best and his decision is the final one, which by and large I think people around him accept. So the styles were completely different. Vajpayee, to use a better example, Vajpayee a bit like Rajiv Gandhi, Mr. Modi a bit like Indira Gandhi.
Anupam is asking, how does it feel to be recognized as the best known Indian journalist of your generation?
You know, I'm not even sure I am the best known Indian journalist by generation. Somebody once wrote this in a bio they did of me, and that bio has been going around, and it's fair to say that I haven't done anything to change it or whatever. I think I am one of the better known journalists by generation, but that's by virtue of two things. One is I'm on television and print, which gives me greater visibility, and two, I'm very old. I've been around for a long time, so people know who I am.
Vivek is asking, you have done everything: a TV show, print journalism, food criticism, travel shows. What's one thing you love the most?
Writing. I mean, the honest answer is writing. I do television and I enjoy doing television, but it's very strenuous. I think people realize that you see a travel show and you think, I am in some glamorous location and I must be having fun. But it's never fun because you're not just alone in a glamorous location. You're accompanied by a whole crew. They want you to do a shot. Let's take a simple shot of you walking into a restaurant. You think that's easy, right? It's not, because they'll shoot it from two different cameras. They'll make you walk in. Then they'll say, we didn't get it again. We didn't get it right. Can you do it again? So there's a certain staged and repetitive quality to television which gets a little wearying after a while.
Okay, we have another question. You are a very successful journalist and now a writer. What advice you have got for up and coming journalists?
Depends. I mean, if you're very young and you're thinking of entering journalism, my advice would be don't. I mean, this is brutal, but it's true. I think the media are in a state of flux. Nobody knows what the future of journalism is. It does look, if you look at the world, like there will be less and less room for journalism. Of course, journalism will not die. There will always be jobs in journalism, but they will be there'll be few and far between. So if you want to think of it as a career, be careful. If you're already in journalism and you're doing it, my advice essentially is don't stick to whatever you're doing. Try and understand other media. Try and understand the digital world. Try and do things in different ways from the ways your bosses tell you to. Your bosses learned how to be journalists 20 years ago, 30 years ago. The world they grew up in no longer exists. So make your own decisions. The world is changing very quickly.
We have another question from Mr. Bhaskar Agarwal.
Okay.
Mr. Sanghvi, can you please share your recommendation for the top 5 restaurants which we should visit in India?
You know, this is a minefield, because if you answer this question, then somebody from Chennai will say, how come they're all North Indian? Somebody from Bombay will say, why are there so many in Delhi? So I'm always very hesitant to recommend 5 restaurants all over India, because frankly, I haven't been all over India. There may be the best restaurant in India, maybe in Shillong, and I don't know it. So I'm hesitant, but I'll tell you what I go to quite often. In Bombay, my favorite restaurant is a place called Som, which is in Babulnath in South Bombay. It's a place that does Gujarati food, that does the best bhel I've had, and I actually love it. It's vegetarian, Gujarati, but my favorite. In Delhi, there are many, many good restaurants. Indian Accent, which is probably the best restaurant in India, run by Manish Mehrotra, is in Delhi. In Chennai, my friend Reggie Matthew runs very good restaurants, Kappa Chakka, something or the other, which I think is very nice. There is also Avartana, which is probably the best modern South Indian restaurant in the world. So, 3, 4. I'm trying to think where else. I keep trying to think of a restaurant in Calcutta so I can be sort of even-handed, but no, I can't think of one. If you want Chinese food, the 2 best Chinese restaurants in India are both in Delhi. China Kitchen at the Hyatt and Shank Palace at the Shangri-La. Kya baki? What have I not said?
You have completed.
So this place, I think we've done
this place also.
And oddly enough, we're shooting this at the JW Marriott, where before we started shooting, I had the most amazing ham and cheese sandwich. It also has, and I didn't know this until I came here one day for lunch, it also has an Italian chef and amazing Italian food. I'm told the Chinese food is also very good, but I guess I'll find out. Okay.
Fantastic.
Do we need to do another commercial? Or
no, that's okay.
Right? Okay,
it's such a great hotel, actually.
Thank you. Thank you.
I love it.
Thanks. Yeah. No, I mean, forget all the jokes. The food is really good, to be fair.
Food is really good. Okay. Sandeep is asking another question. If Bollywood wants to make a movie on your life journey, which is the actor that you feel can play your role? And please tell us, why do you feel so?
It's a very sort of odd question, and often it reveals a lot about the person it's asked to. I remember sometime 1998 or 1999, I went to Los Angeles to interview Rupert Murdoch. And Simi Grewal was also in town, and she also did an interview with Murdoch. I did the sort of harder stuff. She did what she does best. And she asked him, I thought, a key question. She said, if they made a movie of your life, who would you like to portray you? And Murdoch didn't think very long. He said Sean Connery, which I thought was interesting because that gave you some insight into how Murdoch thought of himself. And whenever you ask this question, you have to say, give some answer. But I don't know. I really don't watch that many movies where I see characters who are anything like me. Certainly, I haven't seen a Hindi movie with a character who's remotely like me or captures my personality. And in Western movies, I'd love to be George Clooney, but you know, that's not going to happen.
No, but it's a 400-page book, sir.
It is a 400-page book, yes.
Fantastic, actually. One column, sir. Incident.
Yeah.
It's a question from my side.
Yeah.
Like commitment, I have learned. Like I've seen you from my childhood, and yeah, that day when we were.
It always like makes me nervous when old guys like this say, "Sir, I have seen you since my childhood." But go on, yeah.
Okay. So this was an incident in JW Marriott when your mom passed away. Like,
yeah. You were there, right?
Yeah. So, like, how do you carry like these kind of emotions and like?
He's talking about an event at the JW Marriott in Juhu. Sachin and I, as you know, are part of Easy Diner, and we had an Easy Diner event at the Marriott, and we were there. My mother was also in Bombay. I knew she was unwell, and I knew she was quite seriously unwell, but I decided that, you know, the show must go on, so we went ahead with the event anyway. Halfway through the event, I got a call, and it said she's got like a few minutes left, leave now. So I left Juhu where we were holding the event, and I went to Carmichael Road where she lived, and she died when I was on my way. So it was one of the most traumatic things in my life, and I often wonder, should I have just cancelled the event and been there? And then my mother was quite a bad way. She had no idea I was around by the end. She had no cognition. She was barely conscious. And I decided that no, I think it was better that I went ahead and did not cancel and disappoint all the people who had depended on me. She would never have known. But yeah, those are the regrets. Those are the questions you ask yourself in life. That's what you were asking for, right?
Yes, sir. Very emotional, and commitment, actually, anybody can learn from there, like when you commit something. Okay, so another question is, what's your most memorable root food column from a writer's perspective?
Yeah, honest answer is they all merge into one. I don't remember them. You know, there's a book called Root Food, and then many years later we did more Root Food, the second book, and that's called The Indian Pantry. And I read some of those pieces, and there's one thing about me is whenever I read anything I've written, I hate it because I keep finding mistakes in it. I keep finding phrases that I've used too often. So, but once you get past my own self-critical style, it's like, my God, I read really badly. Once you get past that, what was interesting was that so much of the content came as a surprise to me. I said, oh my God, really? Did I know that? Did I know that? So I have no perspective on my writing. I'm sorry.
Okay, so we'll take the last question.
Okay.
This is Anupam. I have read the book and found Amitabh Bachchan
part quite interesting. Can you please share that incident?
Which one? There are many. There's actually several Amitabh Bachchan stories in the book. There's a story about 1980, I think it was, when Amitabh was still God. He had already become God in terms of Bollywood, a term he hates, but still, in Bollywood terms, he was king, and he had banned the press. He'd banned the press because Stardust were writing things about him which he felt were scandalous and scurrilous. His view, he had not banned the press, they had banned him, so we won't go there. But I was working for India Today, and I believed, rightly or wrongly, that if we went to him and we said we'll do a proper story for India Today, we won't do a gossipy story, he would cooperate. And I was right, he did cooperate. So I spent 10 days with him. I would join him on the sets in the morning, and at night when he went after the last shift, I would go home, come back early the next morning and join him. So that gave me quite an insight into what he was like as a person. This is 1980. Then, many years later, I think it must have been 86, after he joined politics, we got to know each other again, and I spent quite a lot of time with him. And he was going through a really bad phase, particularly in 1987, when he resigned from Parliament. I don't think he should ever have joined politics. He was outmaneuvered, used by people. He left, I think, saying, I want to have no more to do with this. And of course, that wasn't possible because people like VP Singh had turned attacking Amitabh Bachchan into a cottage industry. So it was a steady stream of lies, innuendo, gossip, scurrilous stories about him. And so I think it took him till 1991 to fight all those stories. And I knew him during that period. And it was interesting because that was the phase when his career, he'd been king earlier, really went to an eclipse. And I kept saying, you think it's because of your political problems? And he kept saying they're two completely separate things, politics and film. And then I'm trying to remember which year it was. It may have been 91, I think it was. His brother filed a case against a Swedish newspaper in London, which had alleged he was involved in Bofors. And rather than defend itself, the Swedish newspaper apologized and paid the Bachchans damages. I was with him on the plane when we came back, and there were crowds at the airport to receive him. His reputation had been redeemed. He never looked back. And a very strange thing happened. He'd made a film called Aaj Ka Arjun, which I don't know if you remember. It's not a very memorable film. Just possibly one of the worst films he'd ever made in his career. And I've been sort of chugging along at the box office. But the moment this verdict came, and the moment it was clear that he'd been acquitted, and he'd been exonerated, he wasn't being acquitted, that he was innocent, the film suddenly became a super hit. And after that, the run of super hits continued. So yes, politics and film were connected. Are we through? You want to ask me more? I'm happy to answer.
No, we are. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching it. And now I would request this QR code you will be seeing to do the feedback. Please do that. Thank you so much. And
thanks, Sachin.
Thank you, boss.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much.